योऽन्तः प्रविश्य मम वाचमिमां प्रसुप्तां सञ्जीवयत्यखिलशक्तिधरस्वधाम्ना अन्यांश्च हस्तचरणश्रवणत्वगादीन् प्राणान् नमो भगवते पुरुषाय तुभ्यम्. Hi, my name is Vivek Rallabandi, and today I'd like to talk to you about the future of the Hindu-American diaspora. Now, I know the title is in and of itself very ambitious, and I don't um, present myself as an authority on this subject by any stretch of the imagination, but I think what I'm endeavoring to do through this presentation is at least sort of lay the groundwork for some conversations to be had on various aspects of what the Hindu-American diaspora's roadmap ahead actually looks like in several fields or several areas. And I am a member of the Hindu-American diaspora myself. I was born and raised in the United States, born to immigrants from India who emigrated from India to the United States in the 1990s. And so this is not merely an academic observation that I can deliver in a purely detached fashion. It's something that applies to me as well, because again, I am a part of this community. Nonetheless, I will try to sort of characterize the trends and the phenomena that I talk about in as detached a manner I can, without sort of making any value judgments, without kind of issuing my opinion on what I think about the trends that I believe are taking place as we speak, and that I believe will continue in the decades to come. And so I guess I should start by kind of talking about what the context is that we are operating within when we're having this conversation. And so if you look at this graph here, you can see that since 1990, the number of Indian immigrants in the United States has skyrocketed. Between 1990 to 2000 alone, you saw the number of immigrants more than double. And now it's at, in 2021, according to the US Census Bureau, somewhere around 2.7 million people. And so, of course, not all of these people are Hindu. You have people who are Sikh, Muslim, Buddhist, Jain, etc. But in line with the proportion of India's population that is Hindu, it is safe to assume and it's safe to understand that the large majority of these Indian immigrants in the United States are Hindu. So now you're looking at a pretty substantial block, a pretty substantial minority in the American population as a whole. And when I say pretty substantial, I'm talking about somewhere around maybe 1 to 2% at most. I'm not, saying a significant minority where we're talking about 10 or 15%. But the number of Indian immigrants in the United States, and by extension Hindu immigrants in the United States, Indian immigrants in the United States, is such that we can have a conversation about what this community is going to look like in the future, and we can have a conversation about the fact that this community is crafting its own unique identity, a unique form of Hinduism, a unique American Hinduism, which has been written about in the scholarly context. So the bottom line is, if the population is such a micro minority that there is not significant scope for sociologically analyzing what's going on with that population and sort of making macro level observations, this might be a futile conversation. But I think very clearly what you can see is that the population is a still burgeoning population, still increasing population, and the population is such that you can actually understand it as an independent entity that is in the process of crafting a unique identity for itself, which is a process that will continue over time. It's an ongoing phenomenon, ongoing process. So I want to talk about the case of American Jews, and I am of the firm belief that when you're looking at American Hinduism and the trends that you're seeing among the Hindu American diaspora in the United States, looking at American Judaism as a reference point is a very, very effective approach. And I say this for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's with American Jews, they were in American history the largest non-Christian population that was in the United States, that is in the United States, that emigrated from other countries, predominantly Europe, during the turn of the 20th century, so the late 1800s, early 1900s. This was sort of the Ellis Island period of migration, where you didn't have country quotas and things like that that were later imposed in the early 20th century as a response to the alarms that some, ethno-nationalist forces within the United States were sounding over what they perceived to be unchecked immigration from Europe of Jews and other perceived undesirable populations. But you had these substantial waves of Jews that were coming into the United States, again primarily through Ellis Island. And so this is also a religious minority, kind of an ethnic, and Judaism has been described as both an ethnic identity as well as a religious identity, which makes it interesting. Now, I don't think that Hinduism can necessarily be characterized in the same sense, but there is definitely an argument to be made with the fact that Hindu identity, by and large, is significantly tied up with India and with what is in India in terms of places of Hindu pilgrimage, centers of Hindu philosophical authority, so different mathas, monasteries of different sampradayas, etc., etc. And you can say this while acknowledging the fact that the Hindu diaspora has already branched out, such that the Hindu diaspora globally is not tied exclusively to India, but in the way that with Judaism, Israel can be seen as sort of the birthplace, the motherland of Judaism, in sort of a religious nationalism in that color. And obviously, Israel being officially recognized as a Jewish state, this is all the more reaffirmed. And even though that has not necessarily been politically affirmed in the context of India, because the country is still secular by law, there is, I think, a consensus largely among the Hindu community and the Hindu diaspora across the globe that there is a special significance that India holds in terms of Hinduism and Hindu identity. So that is something that also ties the two populations together with Jews and Hindus, is this sort of tie back to a particular land, to a particular state, which we will go and look at later in some more detail here. So with American Jews, it's very interesting to see how these individuals were coming to the United States, and after coming to the United States, how they understood their identity, how they adapted their identity, how they assimilated into the great American melting pot, and to what extent they held on to or shed aspects of their identity. So I want to first look at this excerpt. This is from a paper, 1946 journal article, talking about trends in a particular New England Jewish community in terms of intermarriage. And the paper looks at from the mid-1800s all the way up to, I think, the 1940s even. So it's a pretty large range. But I'm just going to read this because I think this is very interesting. The Derby rabbi, whose other attitudes were ultra-conservative, had no objection to these interdenominational unions. When the writer asked him if he approved of these marriages, he replied, "Why not? Jews are Jews, whether Orthodox, conservative, or Reformed. The lines are really meaningless." And so the reason that I am highlighting this excerpt is really to show that the first part of assimilation, the first step of American assimilation, as you see with the Jews, is kind of a blurring of denominational lines and a blurring of ethnic lines. So obviously you have different denominations within the Jewish fold, Orthodox, Conservative, Reformed, and so the practices and the approaches to religion differ between each denomination, and so the writer here, Barron, seems to ostensibly think that a rabbi who was otherwise quite orthodox in his practices in the United States would have an objection to Jews marrying across denominational lines, and he's surprised to learn that the rabbi has no objection. And this is again a first step to assimilation, is the blurring of intra-religious, intra-ethnic lines. And so that kind of gives rise to what you see to the right here, which is marriage outside the religious fold. And here you can see these are figures from Pew Research, which does a lot of demographic research in the United States. It's a very reputable source for this kind of data. And you can see that this is from 2020, this data, so relatively recent. So looking at all married Jews as a whole, the percentage of Jews whose spouse is Jewish is 58%, and then this percentage of Jews whose spouse is not Jewish is 42%. So the majority of Jews as a whole in the United States today, or as in 2020, have who are married have a spouse who is Jewish, but a significant minority of them do not. And I think what is more interesting is, okay, so how does the demographic, how does the trend actually look as you look over time? So before 1980 all the way to 2010 to 2020. And so you can see that, before 1980, you had an overwhelming majority of Jews, married Jews, who were marrying other Jews at 82%. Jump from 2010 to 2020, and you have, for the first time, a majority of Jews, married Jews, who are marrying someone who is not Jewish. So you can see how the trend is actually unraveling, what direction this is actually going in, and it wouldn't be, I think, unprecedented to think that the net number of, or percentage of Jews who are married to someone Jewish will decrease over time, because right now it's being bolstered by older generations who at much greater rates were marrying people from the same faith group. So the argument here is that the dissolution of intra-faith boundaries when it comes to marriage, once interdenominational marriage is happening, that sort of eases the way for the next step, which is for marriage to take place outside of the religious group. And my argument is that the same thing holds true and will hold true in the case of Hindus in the United States. And in the Indian Hindu context, the primary divides are threefold, I would say, and they are language, varna, and sampradaya. And so I'm just going to touch on each of them because I think each of them is very interesting and very important to look at and to talk about in some detail. So language is the first one. Language in the Indian context, anyone who knows a thing about India knows that India is very linguistically diverse, right? You have almost every state, every region has its own language, particularly in South India. You have Tamil in Tamil Nadu, Telugu in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana, Malayalam in Kerala, etc., etc. And even in the north, where there is a significant prevalence of Hindi, you have many dialects, Awadhi, Bhojpuri, and the like, and you have other sort of regional languages, such as Kumaoni in parts of Uttarakhand. So the linguistic diversity is mind-boggling, and then even among languages, you have different dialects. With Telugu, which is my mother tongue, for example, you have a different dialect that's spoken in Telangana than in parts of Andhra, and even within Andhra Pradesh, you have different dialects depending on the region. So the linguistic diversity is mind-boggling, and the transmission of culture in the Indian slash Hindu sense, and I keep conflating the two, and that's quite a deliberate thing because I think that it's very difficult in this context to really try to separate the two, and people say, oh, Hinduism is a way of life, and I think it is true because I think so much of what you call Indian culture is bound up with religious practices, intrinsically intertwined, such that again it's very hard to speak of the two as separate entities that are not interrelated. So that is the conflation is a deliberate one in that sense. And so the traditional, in an Indian context, obviously, if you're in India, you are overwhelmingly likely to be marrying somebody who is speaking the same language as you, same Indian language as you. And so that will be the language that you're speaking at home, and that will be the language that you're transmitting to your children. That will be their, mother tongue, right? And that is, typically how any language is transmitted is through the parents to the child. I mean, that's the natural way that any language is transmitted and learned. And intermarriage in the diaspora context disrupts that process. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second once I cover the other two divides. The second divide is Varna, and Varna, I guess, and most people know this by the moniker caste, which I think has been established to be a misnomer and quite an oversimplification of a very complex system, very complex Indian social system with Varna and Jati. But again, traditionally in the Indian context, marriage happens still for the most part, and happened historically within Varna context. So you would generally be marrying somebody of the same Varna. So, if I'm a, Vaishya, I would be marrying someone of that same community. And obviously it's not so simple because Jati is also kind of a subdivision, within Varna. And then, so, when I say something like Vaishya, it might be in the context of, Rajasthan or something like that, the Marwadi community, which is effectively, the Vaishya community. So the Marwadi slash, Baniya kind of trading communities, and that's a Jati divide, right? So you're typically marrying within those communities. It's an endogamous marriage tradition. And so this is also undermined in the diaspora. This is also something that is becomes increasingly irrelevant. And the last one is sampradaya, or religious tradition, religious denomination, and this is also interesting slash important. Particularly, I mean, I would say that a broad swath of people in India, and Hindus in India would subscribe to what you would call a Smarta tradition, which is kind of an integrated Advaita based tradition where you're worshiping deities across the Hindu pantheon, again as embodiments of the same one, the same Brahma Tattva, and you might be venerating with special attention a particular Ishtadeva, favorite deity, favorite personal deity, and or a Kuladevata or Kuladevi, who is a deity who belongs to your family or clan. And so beyond that, you have, again, different denominations, different sampradayas that have arisen. Sri Vaishnava is the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya, pioneered by Ramanujacharya, is one example. The Dvaita Sampradaya of Madhvacharya, again, also native to Karnataka and South India, is another one. You have many other sampradayas that have arisen in different parts of India, the Vallabhacharya Sampradaya within the context of the Vaishnava, broader Vaishnava tradition, which is prevalent in the north. So you have many, and typically marriage happens within those sampradaya groups, in addition to within the language and Varna groups, um, because there are particular traditions associated with each sampradaya, and marriage is usually the way that those traditions, sampradaya specific traditions, are upheld and passed down. So the bottom line is that whether it be language or varna or sampradaya, marriage is the bedrock, that upholds any traditions associated with any of these things. And I think that that is why I believe, and I have argued in the past, that marriage is kind of the bedrock of Dharmic society, Hindu society, that has upheld Hindu society for millennia and will continue to uphold Hindu society, in the years, and centuries to come. So when these divides start to dissipate, so this is akin to when we took the example of American Jewry, the interdenominational marriages that the New England rabbi condoned, right? And so let's look at language first, because I think this might be the most interesting one actually out of all of the three factors that I just mentioned. And I'm just going to read from this excerpt here, which is from a 2006 paper, Ethnic Capital and Intermarriage: A Case Study of American Jews. Um, as ethnicity is most fully experienced in community, free riding is at least as serious a problem as it is for religion. There is little incentive to speak an ethnic language, for instance, if there is no one to converse with. If non-producers are able to benefit from the positive externalities produced by others, there is little incentive to expend capital on a good they can receive for free. Sanctioning then is particularly important for the production of ethnicity as a collective good. So basically, I mean, the two sentences that I underlined are, I think, the most important here. There's little incentive to speak an ethnic language if there's no one to converse with. Absolutely, spot on. And so what happens with this intermarriage, linguistic intermarriage? So I'll just give you an example to make an abstract concept more concrete. So I'm Telugu, and I've fallen, and so I'm in the United States, and I go to college, and I go to a place like Rutgers University in New Jersey, which has a very high Indian and by extension Hindu population, and I meet a girl. She is from, say, Gujarat, and Varna and Sampradaya and whatever might align. I mean, forget about all of that, but let's just talk about language, right? And so she is of a different linguistic background than I am, and we fall in love, and we get married, and we have a child. So what is that child going to be learning? What language is that child going to be learning? What language is that child going to be speaking? The overwhelming likelihood is that the language that that child will learn will be English, and that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, the conversation that I and my wife in this scenario would be having would likely be in English, because I don't know Gujarati, she doesn't know Telugu. Even if it's also questionable that the people in this scenario, if me, I, as a first generation American, so the child of immigrants to the United States who were from Andhra Pradesh, so whose mother tongue is Telugu, whether or not I learned Telugu properly and whether my Telugu proficiency is actually up to par is in and of itself questionable in this scenario. Now, I think I speak pretty good Telugu, but I'm just, for the sake of this scenario, I'm saying if I didn't speak good Telugu myself, even if I married someone who was also Telugu and their proficiency was also not up to par, it would be questionable if we would still be passing on Telugu anyway. Now, would it be more likely that we would pass on that language to our children if both parties in that marriage were Telugu? Probably, right? But even the question of whether the first generation Americans that are entering into these relationships are even proficient in their mother tongue to a sufficient extent to pass that mother tongue on to their children is questionable. That's the first thing. The second thing is you're operating within an American context where you are an ethnic minority again. And so culture becomes, subsumed by the larger American, lifestyle, culture, etc. So you're operating in an American context. You interpret that American context in English. English is the context that you're getting your education, that you're interacting with other people in the workplace, etc., etc. So and especially if if in this hypothetical scenario I met my wife in college, that's a setting that's primarily mediated by, understood through the lens of English. And so it is overwhelmingly likely that we would have been, started to interact in English. We would have been speaking in English when we met, when we were courting each other, whatever the case might be. And so ultimately, to after marriage suddenly kind of say, okay, now we're going to switch to speak some sort of Indian language, and what is that Indian language even going to be? It's a real stretch. It takes extraordinary dedication, effort, commitment that 99% of people are not going to be able to or even want to put in order to get to a place like that. And I'm saying that even if you are both speaking the same language, that are, the both parties in that relationship, still needs effort, dedication, commitment. And the best case scenario in that sense is that when both parties are speaking the same language, both parties are proficient, they can speak that language fluently, then you have the best case. And it still requires dedication, it still requires effort, because you're still operating in a society which does not speak that language predominantly. So you still have to actually go out of your way. You have to make conscious effort to make sure that that language is being spoken. But it is much more likely that you will be able to actually speak that language, uphold it, pass it on to your children. But the bottom line is that, from anecdotal experience, this is not something that a lot of people are making a priority when they're thinking about marriage. They're thinking about relationships is, okay, I have to marry someone that's, okay, also speaks the same language as me. And the second sentence there that I underlined, if non-producers are able to benefit from the positive externalities produced by others, there's little incentive to expend capital on a good they can receive for free. And that goes to what I have on the right for you here, which these are sets of children's books that were developed sort of for a Western/American context. One is Purna Vidya. This is developed by Arshavidya Peetham/Arshavidya Gurukulam, which was founded by Swami Dayananda Saraswati. He is a sannyasi. He was a sannyasi in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and Arshavidya Gurukulam, which is his headquarters in America that he established, is located in Pennsylvania, and they have developed a series of courses known as Purna Vidya. And Purna Vidya is basically it's in English. It's basically designed to be used in sort of a Hindu quote unquote Sunday school context. And again, so this is in English. It conveys different stories from the Mahabharata, Ramayana, different values and different principles and tenets of Hindu Dharma. But it is communicated in English. And obviously this makes the most sense, because even if the kids that are coming to these classes all can speak their mother tongue, there's no commonality. You have one kid who's speaking Gujarati, another one who's speaking Telugu, another one who's speaking Hindi, another one who's speaking Tamil. So it English, and they're all learning English in school anyway, and so the proficiency in their mother tongue is also quite questionable. It's you don't really know, and so English is a safe bet. Everyone can speak English, everyone can understand English, and so that's the medium through which these things are being communicated. The same point goes for, and this is just Balavihar book series. This is by Chinmaya Mission, which is another organization that is also has a significant presence in the United States, and you have other things like Hanuman Chalisa that you can see here, and other kind of moral stories and things like that. And again, all of these things are produced in English. And Chinmaya Mission also does this sort of Bala Vihar, again, kind of roughly equivalent to a Sunday school sort of thing, where you have spiritual values based education that's going on. And so all of this is being done in English. So basically the point here is that if non-producers are able to benefit from the positive externalities produced by others, there is little incentive to expend capital on a good they can receive for free. So basically what that means in this context is, if you're able to get everything you want to get, if you're able to get whatever spiritual fulfillment that you want, okay, I want to pass, I'm a first generation American. I marry, so again, let's go back to that Telugu-Gujarati example, where I'm Telugu, my wife is Gujarati, and it's okay, we want to pass on Hinduism to our children. Like, that's something that we had growing up. Like, that's something that we want to pass on to our kids. Okay, we have these resources available, and, we can send them to classes and do things where their knowledge of Hinduism and their contact with their Hindu identity is not contingent on them knowing a mother tongue, knowing an Indian language. Now, that's not to say that knowing that language would not be advantageous. It absolutely would. I mean, there's just no two ways about that. But it is not an absolute necessity. And the last sentence in this paragraph here is also interesting. It says, sanctioning then is particularly important for the production of ethnicity as a collective good. And basically, the context in which the authors are saying that is that if you actually want to maintain ethnic boundaries, then there has to be some sort of, there has to be some sort of reinforcement. There has to be some sort of fear of punishment, not in a little, outcasting sense, but some sort of stigma that might be cast on those who are marrying outside of those boundaries, that are sort of bucking this endogamous practice. And this is interesting because I think that this is becoming slowly normalized in the diaspora context. So, okay, I'm a Telugu, guy who's marrying a Gujarati girl. Okay, there might be some people in my sort of circle of family, friends, people who, again, are probably people who have emigrated from India to the United States, who are also Telugu, who are also part of, my community, who might perhaps frown upon what I'm doing, who might perhaps say, oh, it might have been better if he married someone who was also Telugu. But it's not that, okay, well, we're never talking to him again. Like, we're completely cutting him out of our circle. This is not the sort of, ostracization that is playing out. And to be very clear, I'm not advocating for that. I'm not saying that that's what should be happening. I'm just saying that because there's not that sort of social pressure, and because it has become largely accepted in the diaspora, that you can marry someone outside your language boundaries. You can marry someone outside your Varna divide. You can marry someone that's outside your Sampradaya. If they're Hindu, that's enough. Like, this has become the least common denominator, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the slides to come. And so I think one of the particularly important things that needs to be noted, which I think is also worth mentioning on this point of sanctioning before I move on here, and I think when you're looking at why are all of these kind of internal internecine divides crumbling among the diaspora, it's because there is kind of a tacit condemnation on the part of the parents of these diaspora youth, who might be in the best position to perhaps deter those individuals from quote-unquote transgressing, from quote-unquote crossing those boundary lines. And so, for example, the parents might not be terribly thrilled in some instances that, okay, my kid is marrying somebody who is not of the same language, or not of the same varna, or not of the same sampradaya, because especially coming from the motherland, which is India for the most part, they care about these things more. From a social standpoint, they care about these things more. From a standpoint of sampradaya and things like that, they understand, okay, this is very important. Okay, if my future son-in-law or daughter-in-law is of the same sampradaya as we are, then, it makes sense because we can uphold that, because that matters to me. But is that impetus on the part of the parents so great that they are willing to basically put their foot down and say, okay, if you do not marry someone of this varna, of this, whatever, then, all hell is going to break loose. Like, I am just certainly not going to stand for that at all. Like, is that the extent to which they're willing to go? And I think in many cases the answer is no. There might be a preference. They might subtly goad their children in that direction. But honestly, I mean, it is often impractical. Unless the parents really from the get-go sort of instill in their children that, okay, these are the lines that you have to stick within, and it's kind of a non-negotiable. And even then, love takes its own course, right? So, and oftentimes I think what the parents' mindset is, okay, at least they married someone Hindu, at least they married someone Indian, at least it's not someone of another faith, because interfaith marriage brings its own, set of complications, that at least if you're marrying within the Hindu faith, there's a common cultural context, common religious context, or at least you have the bare minimum least common denominator. And so I think on the parents' end, there might be an iota of dissatisfaction, certainly maybe a little bit of discontentment, but that is probably outweighed by the sense of relief that, okay, at least it wasn't worse. And I think that that is often something that is subtly facilitating, or at least something that is a potential hindrance that is in many cases not hindering the crumbling of these barriers. And this is simply an inescapable phenomenon. I think, when any population is a minority in a particular location, there is bound to be homogenization. You cannot maintain heterogeneous identities completely when you are a minority in a particular place. And so that's exactly what happened with American Jews. That's exactly what's happening with American Hindus. That is even what is happening in places like Bangladesh, where you have Hindus as a minority of the population, somewhere around 10% of the population, where Varna identities, Varna divides are much less pronounced in the context of Bangladesh among the Hindu population versus even in India. So people are largely not as aware of their Varna identity in the context of Bangladeshi Hindus. Okay, if the person is Bangladeshi Hindu, I'm marrying them. Okay, I don't really care about anything else at that point. And in India, the fact that Hindus are a majority or a significant majority, you, I guess, have the quote unquote luxury to actually care about these distinctions and actually be choosy. But when you're a minority, you sort of don't have the luxury of doing that. And I think that is very much what you see happening with these three things: language, Varna, and Sampradaya. Okay, so now you have this question of identitarian versus pan-Hindu organizations, and this is just going right off of the points that we just made. And so on the left side of the screen here, you see two identitarian organizations. One is Jir Educational, and these are just examples, but one is Jir Educational Trust, JET. This is a Sri Vaishnava organization. So this is a Sampradaya-based organization based in the United States, which they have a larger presence in India, but again, significant number of devotees in the United States. So a particular American branch was created. So this is a Sampradaya-based organization, Jir Educational Trust, JET. It's led now by the present pontiff, Chinnajir Swamiji, who is you can see him here. There to the left is Ramanujacharya. And so this is a Sampradaya-based organization that has a presence in the United States. And again, how is Sampradaya maintained? Right? Sampradaya is maintained through intermarriage. And because, okay, if I'm someone who is Sri Vaishnava and I'm also marrying someone who's Sri Vaishnava, and then I'm passing on Sri Vaishnava traditions to my children, that is how Sri Vaishnava traditions are upheld. And so, for example, within the Sri Vaishnava tradition, you have something called Samashrayanam, which is sort of a formal initiation into the Sri Vaishnava fold. Usually for men, it happens during the Upanayana, during the Upanayana ceremony, sacred thread ceremony. For women, it usually happens right after marriage. So this is literally, you have pancha samskaras, which are five different samskaras, five different rituals that formally initiate you into the Sri Vaishnava fold. You have the Shankha and Chakra, the conch and discus of Lord Vishnu, the insignia of Vishnu, which are branded on your shoulders, for example. That's one of the samskaras. So you really are only incentivized to do these things and actually enter into the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya and accept a particular Sri Vaishnava teacher as your acharya when both parents are Sri Vaishnava and they are committed to raising their children within the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya. And so only when that is happening do identitarian organizations, Sampradaya-based identitarian organizations like this, actually maintain force and actually stick around. That's the first thing. The second organization that you see here is akka, which stands for Association of Kannada Kotas of America. So Kannada Kotas are kind of local Kannada-based, so language-based groups. So Kannada is a language native to Karnataka, which is a South Indian state, right? And so this is kind of a national consortium of those local/regional organizations. So again, Kannada in the United States and Kannada identity, a distinct Kannada identity in the United States, is only upheld, I would argue, significantly when you have people who are Kannadigas, people who are speak Kannada, marrying other people who speak Kannada, teaching their children Kannada. And right now, these organizations, whether it's JET or whether it's akka, are sticking around because you're still largely these organizations, these things are fueled by immigrants from India, immigrants who are bringing this sampradaya or who are bringing this language over from India. So for Jet, for example, most people, most communicants of Jet who attend Jet services, programs, events, etc., are Sri Vaishnavas who probably had adopted Sri Vaishnavism, who had been born into Sri Vaishnava families in India, and they came carrying that. Whether their children will continue that tradition by marrying someone within that same sampradaya and maintaining a connection to these sorts of organizations like JET is an open question. Same thing goes for Akka. And these are again just examples. So now let's go to the other side of this, to the right. And these are pan-Hindu organizations in the United States. One is HSS, Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh. The other one here is Chinmaya Mission, which we talked about briefly, and the last one is Samskrita Bharati USA. Samskrita Bharati USA is a bit of an interesting case. I'm going to talk about that last. But HSS and Chinmaya Mission, these are both pan-Hindu organizations. They don't really necessitate that you belong to a particular sampradaya, belong to a particular linguistic group. So, and you know, HSS is sort of more of a you know, building pan-Hindu solidarity, where I would say something like Chinmaya Mission is more so catering to the spiritual side of Hindu identity, whereas HSS I would say is more of a I hesitate to use the word political, but more so kind of creating a sense of pan-Hindu unity and upholding that in a more perhaps advocacy-based sense. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think that might be the one way to kind of view the distinct but kind of, I think, complementary roles of such organizations. Um, Excuse me. So these organizations, again, I think these organizations will have currency in the long run in the diaspora in the United States because they are serving essential functions. Again, I think for HSS in particular, building a pan-Hindu solidarity and pan-Hindu identity. I think HSS does that, and I think Chinmaya Mission caters to the spiritual aspects of Hindu life by talking about things like the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, etc., but doesn't necessarily require a linguistic background or tie of any sort. So again, let's go back to my Telugu-Gujarati example. I keep going back to this. Okay, but our child who might know a little bit of Telugu here or there because his grandparents, you know, meaning my parents, might teach him some words and I might teach him some words, and then he might know a little bit of Gujarati here or there because my wife and her parents might teach him some words. But he's not particularly fluent at either. He mostly speaks English. We talk to him in English. We might throw in a Telugu or Gujarati word here or there, but it's largely in English, and that's what he's speaking. Okay, and that's kind of his first language is English. Our child here, and so. Could he go to something like, you know, and there's an organization, you know, something like Telugu classes or something like that? Yeah, perhaps we could send him to that. But again, his first language is English. Okay, maybe if we really wanted to teach him Telugu, we could. But it's much more likely that we would want, if we wanted him to maintain ties to Hinduism, we wanted him to, okay, he should be tied to his Hindu faith. We could send him to something like Chinmaya Mission, where they're going to teach through English. We're going to send him to something like HSS, where again he can interact with other Hindu kids his age, and you know it's done through English, and he kind of develops a sense of his Hindu identity. Okay, so these are really, I think, you know, I think the identitarian organizations are going to be on a downswing over a period of time, and it's these pan-Hindu organizations that are going to be on, you know, see an upsurge in interest and participation. Samskrita Bharati is a particularly interesting case because Sanskritam is a language, and as you probably know, an ancient Indian language. Most scriptures and most texts in the Hindu faith are written in Sanskritam. And so Samskrita Bharati, which originally started in India and has now also expanded to the US and other countries, has endeavored to make Sanskritam a spoken language. So actually bring it back into spoken use. And you know, Sanskritam is still largely by many people viewed as kind of a dead language like Latin, so not really a spoken language. And so the Samskrita Bharati's approach is teach Sanskritam like you would a natural through a natural learning process, the way someone naturally picks up a language, and through speaking, then you go on to Shastra, studying Shastra and all of that. So it's speaking that's kind of the listening, speaking is the bedrock of study. And Samskrita Bharati teaches both children and adults in India, the US, and other places. So Samskrita Bharati, I think, is interesting because it is a pan-Hindu organization in the sense that you don't need to know a particular language to learn Sanskritam. It is definitely very helpful if you already know an Indian language because there are a lot of cognates because most, Indian languages are derived from Sanskritam. So, excuse me. But for children in the United States that are learning Sanskritam, they don't need to know an Indian language. And the curriculum is designed such that they don't need to know an Indian language because it's quite questionable whether all of them know an Indian language or not, and the degree to which they know that language, their degree of proficiency in that language. And so Samskrita Bharati, I think in the future, as you sort of see kind of an erosion, linguistic erosion, with regional languages because of this intermarriage. And Sanskritam could perhaps serve as a lingua franca for the diasporic Hindu community, which is sort of bereft of any regional language, unified language that they can connect on other than English. And this is actually a spiritually infused language. Sanskritam is so intrinsically intertwined with Hinduism and with Hindu faith that it could serve as that sort of language. And as that sort of link language. And I think that a good example is sort of a good parallel to that is the role that Hebrew has taken on in the Jewish community and the American Jewish community in particular in Hinduism. And Hebrew has been resurrected sort of from, oblivion, near oblivion, to becoming actually a spoken language. And I think that some in the Sanskritam movement have kind of looked at Hebrew as an inspiration for what Sanskritam could ideally reach. And I think the fact that there will be a lacuna, there will be a void, language-wise in the diaspora, there might very well be an opportunity for Sanskritam to fill that void. It's quite possible. And so I think linguistically speaking, that is a something that might perhaps be on the horizon. Okay, so where are we going from here? So I'm almost done. And this is just more so a recap of what I think we already talked about. And these are kind of, concentric circles that are expanding out. At the center you have Varna/language/sampradaya. Then you have religion, which is Hinduism. And then, you have the larger American community. And so if you look at this in terms of intermarriage, the most endogamous thing that you could do is marry someone of the same Varna, same language, same sampradaya. You might buck one or more of these things, and then you might still be in this realm if you're sticking to other things, perhaps. Then expanding out, you have religion, Hinduism, and so this is this sort of the pan-Hindu identity that's being crafted, where these boundaries of Varna, language, and sampradaya gradually dissipate. And then you have the larger American community, and that's actually marrying outside of the Hindu fold, and that's what we talked about with American Judaism and the significant proportions of Jews in America now that are marrying outside, that are choosing to marry people who are not Jewish. And I think that is also an eventuality with the Hindu American community that is going to happen. I mean, obviously, you do see examples already of people that are marrying outside the Hindu fold, but that is still a little bit of an eyebrow raiser. Right now, I think what's become largely normalized is if you're marrying someone Hindu who might not be of the same Varna, language, and or sampradaya, that's been largely normalized. I think marrying someone outside of the Hindu/Indian fold is still a little bit, people are still going to look askance at you a little bit, but that is also going to become increasingly normalized. It's just a process that takes time. We're not there yet. But it's a matter of time. And so I just, to touch on the two things that are highlighted here, one is the pockets of orthodoxy. And so even when these barriers are going to dissipate, as I'm saying, largely, right, these are all macro level trends that we're talking about, but there will be some pockets, I think, where Varna, language, and sampradaya are maintained, where people are going to choose to, okay, I'm staying in the US, I'm staying here, but I'm going to choose to maintain my ties to my Varna, language, and sampradaya, and I'm going to choose to marry endogenously as a matter of choice. Sort of, again, something that you have to make deliberate effort to do. And these are kind of, these pockets of orthodoxy are akin to Orthodox Jewish communities, Hasidic Jews, and, other Orthodox communities that are still upholding very, ultra Orthodox traditions in the United States. They're sending their children to Hebrew schools, to yeshivas, and things of that nature. So Jewish schools and things like that. And even in terms of their dress and all of these things, you see they're outwardly Jewish in terms of wearing outward markers of Jewish identity. And this, yeah, and I think the same thing you would see with these pockets of orthodoxy within the Hindu American fold. Sort of moving out again, within the larger realm of religion, you have, I think, what has already started to take shape, but what will take shape even more so in the days to come, and that is this question of um, cultural Hinduism. And I think that very much you can see with cultural Judaism, where this phenomenon, which I think has been widely recognized at this point, where people will say, okay, I'm a secular Jew, where you're culturally Jewish, you're celebrating things like Passover, you're celebrating things like, Hanukkah and things like that. But for the most part, you're not going to synagogue, you're not keeping kosher, you're not following these tenets of the faith where you would call yourself a practicing Jew. And I think that same thing is already taking shape to some degree with Hinduism, and I think will increasingly happen where it's like, okay, I might go to the temple for New Year's, I might go to the temple for Deepavali or something like that. I'll light firecrackers for Deepavali and eat sweets and whatever. But for the most part, I am not engaging in any sort of regular practice or sadhana or anything of that sort in the Hindu context. And this sort of cultural Hinduism, I think, will definitely start to become more of a thing, and I think that can sort of be chalked up to growing kind of religious disenchantment across the board amongst young people, which is a phenomenon that religious studies scholars and sociologists have been documenting and talking about. And so that is also, and I think that within this realm of cultural Hinduism, you also have things like things within the realm of quote unquote New Age Hinduism, such as where people kind of might be raised Hindu, they might be sort of drifting away from their Hindu identity for a period of time, and then at some point they want to kind of rediscover their Hindu identity, but perhaps with less, kind of orthodox, quote unquote, orthodox constrictions and things like that, and sort of, again, these restrictions of Varna and Sampradaya. And then you might have things like, art of living, or, Isha, which is run by Sadhguru by Jaggi Vasudev. Those sorts of organizations, kind of neo-Hindu, what you might call neo-Hindu organizations that might sort of allow you to kind of harness this kind of spiritual but not religious kind of school of thought or frame of thought, and that kind of overlaps loosely with this idea of cultural Hinduism, or it's in the same general realm. Diaspora connections to the motherland. I'm just going to go through this very briefly because we already touched on this. So Aliyah supporting Jewish people to return home to Israel. So again, Israel being a formally declared Jewish state is something, where they will encourage people who are Jews who are not, living in Israel. So they might be living in the United States, other parts of the world. So you basically have an opportunity to go back to Israel, and the Israeli government financially supports you and supports you in other ways, and you're given citizenship and all of these things. So obviously that might not necessarily in a religious sense be the same story with India, but I mean at the same time many Hindu Americans hold overseas citizenship of India in India. India doesn't allow for dual citizenship, so when people relinquish their Indian citizenship, they to take on U.S. citizenship, which is definitely generally perceived as more desirable, they will take up OCI status. And usually, according to the Citizenship Act and the OCI rules, if you're in India for a period of 12 months with the OCI card, you're able to regain Indian citizenship or gain Indian citizenship if you were never had it in the first place. So it's a relatively simple process, but again, the number of people who are willing to relocate and do these sorts of things, I mean, it's a questionable thing as of now, at least. I mean, it really will depend on what trajectory India takes up in the next couple of decades. I mean, it might actually become an attractive option for resettlement, especially when the brand of American Hinduism that some people in the diaspora, especially those who are more orthodox, who are more sort of attached to their faith and attached to, again, these subdivisions of language, Varna Sampradaya, kind of see some, all of that disintegrating before their eyes largely, and they're like, okay, well, I actually care about these things more than most of my counterparts, and I want a place where I can sort of more fully revel in that identity. India might definitely be a destination for them where they can go back and they can resettle. And it's interesting because some of those people might have never actually lived in India long term. They might have, gone as children, or they might have, stayed there for periods of time. They might have had extended family there, but they might not have actually lived. If my own case, for example, like I never lived in India long term, but I mean, so if I hypothetically went back and settled there, that would be sort of an unprecedented thing. It wouldn't be something that I, ever did in my life, because again, I was never in India long term. So again, that's this sort of thing is a possibility. And I think it's also interesting, more broadly, even though people might not be resettling back in India, what kind of connections might people in the diaspora, as you go on, one or two generations. So for example, like, if I stay in the United States and I end up marrying somebody, whoever it might be, if it's someone Hindu, and then, we have a child, and that child doesn't necessarily have any direct tie to India, because it's not like his or her parents weren't necessarily born in India either. They were also born in the United States. So then the tie is, with the grandparents, and the grandparents were the ones who emigrated from India to the U.S. So the connection to India becomes more and more tenuous directly, and then the connection is more so, has to be a spiritual connection. And I guess that's where this concept of Aliyah and the Jewish/Israeli context becomes relevant. And so that also remains to be seen. I think that very much is an open question, how that connection will play out. And I certainly think that even if people don't relocate, resettle, going back to India is sort of a spiritual rejuvenation, sort of reconnecting with your roots, sort of a thing. I think can very much be kind of a rejuvenating experience for many people. And I think you already see that with for example, some populations, diaspora populations, such as Hindus in the Caribbean, for example, who have maybe been settled there for several generations, so who don't really have ancestral ties to India that are relatively recent, who still, I mean, do go back to India and things like that. And obviously you do feel a spiritual tie, spiritual contentment, especially if you're going to a kshetra, place of pilgrimage, like Varanasi, or something of that sort. Okay, so last but not least, wrapping this up. So just to sum up what we talked about, dilution of sub-identities within the Hindu framework is an inevitability. So Varna, Sampradaya, language, intermarriage is the key driver. That's what's going to do it, and we've been over this. So next, relationship with religion and culture is mediated through English. So Sanskritam and / mother tongue is largely not at your disposal. So English becomes the way that, especially the children of these first generation Americans, who likely will not have a strong mother tongue to latch onto, will start understanding Hinduism and culture, and Indian culture and all of these things through English, and through an English um, literature that is explaining literature, and people that are explaining and talking to them in English. And lack of traditional guidance as the first generation of immigrants starts to disappear. So sort of the torchbearers of tradition, relatively speaking, are those who came directly from India. So basically my parents' generation, people who came from India. And as that generation starts to disappear, as that generation starts to pass, and my generation, our generation, is in the driver's seat, that lack of traditional guidance and traditional knowledge starts to disappear if it hasn't been adequately passed on. And the best case scenario, and I don't mean this in a value judgment sense, but I'm saying I think in terms of preservation of American Hinduism, is a macro level preservation of Hindu identity with some vestiges of identitarian substrata preserved in pockets. And that's exactly what we talked about with, some pockets, some areas where Varna, language, Sampradaya, those sorts of orthodox, and I'm using orthodox as a catch-all term here, might be preserved. But that is the best case scenario, because what we have right now, the landscape as we have it right now with the Hindu American community, this is not going to stick around. Things are going to change. There is going to be a seismic level shift that is happening under our feet, that I think more of us should be talking about, thinking about, and realizing. And I hope that is something that we can talk about, think about, and have conversations about. So thank you very much for listening. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I hope to hear your thoughts, comments, and opinions. This is definitely an ongoing conversation that we need to have. What I'm saying is by no means an authoritative pronouncement on anything. So let's keep the conversation going. Namaste.